And so what often happens when you have this conversation and you open it up is that there's not a really clear understanding of what we mean by engagement, right? And that has also disciplinary implications, right? Like a historian that came up to me at the Organization of American Historians where I was talking about community engagement, and she said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I said, well, think about a public intellectual. And she said, oh, I get that. I mean, it's like, okay, so, right, how do you frame this in disciplinary ways? But what is it we're talking about? And then there's the question of the institutional policies. And let me just give you an example of what I mean. I think I have it here. So here's Syracuse University. Syracuse University revised its promotion and tenure guidelines in, I think it was 2010, right? Not that long ago. This is a private research, very high university. Has changed its promotion and tenure guidelines to specifically articulate community, or what they call publicly engaged scholarship. So this is a really, I like this a lot for a number of reasons, right? So just look at the way this is constructed. Syracuse is committed to long-standing traditions of scholarship, right? So in other words, we're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater here. We recognize these traditions are really important. We value those, right? And we're going to continue to value those, as well as evolving perspectives on scholarship, right? But we recognize things are changing. Syracuse recognizes the role of academia is not static, and that methodologies, how we go about generating knowledge, topics of interest, and boundaries with and between disciplines change over time. The university will continue to support scholars in all of these traditions, including faculty who choose to participate in publicly engaged scholarship. Okay? So this is a really important way to frame this. So it's not an either or, it's not either you do this or you do that, but it says we make space at the university for those who choose to do publicly engaged scholarship, and we value that. Okay?
Excuse me, so that's actually in the university's tenure
And promotion guidelines. You can pull it up online.
Okay.
Yep. Publicly engaged scholarship, now it says, what do we mean by it? May involve partnership of university knowledge and resources with those of the public and private sectors to enrich scholarship, research, and creativity and public knowledge, enhance curriculum teaching and learning, prepare educated, engaged citizens, strengthen democratic values and civic responsibility, address and help solve critical social problems, and contribute to the public good. Right? So it's not only about what it is, but why are we doing this? Why would Syracuse University do this? And again, I want to go back to it's about making space. Okay? Not about saying, oh, we all got to do this, right? Or not about the faculty member who once raised his hand when I was talking about this and said, this is really scary. And I said, well, why is this so scary? He said, well, because it's threatening. He said, I'm a bench scientist. He said, the more you value this, the less you're going to value what I do. And it's not an either or. You got to get out of that. It's not about either this or that. It's about making space so that those who do publicly engaged scholarship are valued for the work that they're doing. It's legitimized at the university, right? So that's why this kind of construction is helpful. Okay, some questions. Go ahead.
How long did it take Syracuse to get to that point from when they first began conversations like these?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And you could answer that in probably a few different ways. On one end of the spectrum, you would say, and this would be the chancellor's point of view, it took about 4 years. And she was really frustrated that it took that long. From another point of view, as a colleague of mine, Gene Rice, who spent years in Washington at AAHE, he looks at this and he said, oh, this work started about 25 years ago. He said when Robert Diamond was on campus and he was helping them think about what kind of scholarship should we be doing, how do we rethink research, and that was like 3 or 4 chancellors ago. So I would argue this has probably been building for a long time, and it kind of reached a point with different leadership where it came to a head. I don't know. It probably depends on where you sit, how you would answer that question. So, yeah.
That was my question. But added onto that, the other part of it is, and I don't know if you know this, but the process of getting there, I mean, kudos to them for getting there, but was the process that got them there collaborative? or sometimes these processes happen in
Yeah,
a lot of
okay,
different
so
ways.
that's gonna, I wanna segue that to the other question. So top down, bottom up, right? So at Syracuse, it was passed through the faculty council with a lot of support from senior faculty. It was collaborative, it was not without contention, okay? And I would say that for some faculty, and again, I don't know the ins and outs of Syracuse, but I would say for some faculty, they perceive this as very top-down. So, you know, but let me shift that a little bit to a study that we did. We did a study of the 2006 Carnegie campuses to try to make sense out of who got classified, what we could learn from it. And there were a group of 7 campuses that we really thought were in sort of that fourth quadrant. They had changed their promotion and tenure guidelines. They sort of have all the institutional pieces in place. And so we're trying to figure out what was going on at those campuses. So then we did a set of interviews with academic leaders on those campuses. And we found something that we weren't looking for. This was actually, we didn't see this coming at all. But what we got back from the data was that there was, on all of these campuses, both a top-down and bottom-up approach going on at the same time. There was grassroots work on the part of faculty, and there was very strong leadership driving it. In fact, there were strong leaders at the top at some of these institutions who saw their leadership role at the top to facilitate grassroots work by the faculty from the bottom up. That's how they saw their role. It was very interesting. Now, what came out of that, which we didn't anticipate, was the role of the deans. And it became really clear that the deans were the gatekeepers. In other words, it's where the top-down and the bottom-up meets. So where deans were supportive, this work just went ahead with gangbusters. But deans could also be the block to it. They could stop it dead in its tracks. And that even came back to deans of certain colleges. So it was never the dean of the College of Education, because the dean of the College of Education has very little power on campuses. I can tell you that from my own college. Right? The most powerful deans were the ones that had the most money and the most students. So either the College, in some cases, of Science and Math, or the College of Liberal Arts, often the one with the most students. And so those key deans became the key gatekeepers to whether or not this stuff unfolded or not. So what does that tell us? It means as we think about this strategically, we know that those deans are going to be critical to the success of this work on the campus. And the other thing to keep in mind with all of that is that top-down, bottom-up, everybody's looking over their shoulders. The faculty are looking over their shoulders to see what their chairs think. The chairs are looking over their shoulders to see what the deans think. The deans are looking over their shoulders to see what the provost thinks. And the provost claims that he's looking over his shoulder because he won't do anything unless the deans are on board, and the deans won't do anything unless the chair. So everybody's looking at everybody else, right? So top down, bottom up, everybody's got to get in this game together, or else it's not going to work, right? Because signals get sent all over the place. That's how culture works. All right, and I want to take that back to a question that came from over here. I think the person left, though. And that was this question about the change to a 4 credit to 3 credit, and was this an opportunity or a challenge? Or you can approach that in a whole bunch of different ways. But one way that I would think about that is that core to this work around community engagement, from a faculty perspective, is that it provides the opportunity for integrated faculty roles in ways that other work just doesn't. And what do I mean by that? Faculty who do community engagement work will talk about in great detail that they don't separate out the categories of teaching and research and service, that they are all integrated as one. In fact, I read promotion and tenure files all the time where this starts out by saying, I can't divide my work into these 3 categories, because the work that I do around teaching and learning is community-based. It's fundamentally tied to the research I do in the community, and it's fundamentally tied to the service work that I do in the community. I can't separate these out. That's really important in terms of thinking about faculty workload, because one of the things that makes faculty work so difficult, particularly in institutions where research requirements are being ramped up, is that it's really hard to be excellent in research when that's over here, and be really good in teaching when that's over here, and be really good in terms of a service contribution if that's over there. And they're very separate activities. You got to be excellent all over the place, and it's killing people, right? Surveys of faculty, young faculty coming up through the ranks, show a lot of dissatisfaction, particularly among women faculty, that they don't want this rat race. They don't want this divided sense of their lives. They don't want it, right? And yet, the faculty who do community engagement work are often women, often faculty of color, right? Often what we think of unrepresented faculty on our campuses, and they do it because it integrates their lives instead of separating them out. So maybe this is an opportunity then, right? As faculty feel like more and more and more is put upon them, then engagement isn't one more thing put upon them, but a way to do their work differently, right? So that it allows for this kind of integration where it's not about having to do these different areas of work, but doing one area of work and doing it really well. So that's just one way to think about that.
The reciprocity question is
Okay.
continue to connect
Yeah.
to the community.
So here's how I think about that. I did this piece with a few colleagues a few years ago, which we called the Democratic Engagement White Paper. We were trying to look at these questions about reciprocity and collaboration. I could tell you a lot of stories about that, but one of the stories was that when we put this out, and we just did it virtually, it went out on the ether, we got responses from all over the globe, literally. But we also got responses from outside of the academy. So I got this really interesting response from the director of an arts organization, and he said, everything you're talking about in higher education explains exactly what's happened in the arts in the last 20 years. Okay? So he said, you know, the kinds of changes you're talking about are also changes that need to take place in the arts. We need to sort of reclaim our public purpose, get back to community engagement, rethink about funding sources, the importance of public art, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't write it for that purpose. And then he said, and you could apply this to other sectors as well. You could apply it to social services and social work. You could apply it a lot of different ways. So it's not just about higher education. So you're right, it's happening all over the place, and so it probably requires changes in other parts too. Right? I do think, though, that we can play a role in the work that we do around community engagement in terms of building the capacity of our community partners to be able to do the kind of collaborative work that we're talking about, and that they are very open to that, but don't necessarily have the resources and capacity building resources that they need to be able to do it. So that's just one way to think about it. And where community partners really are brought in as real collaborators in the process is where I hear them say things like, I mean, I love community partners. So here's just a few of my sort of favorite quotes. Community partners who say, I really want to be a co-educator. Right? Now what is that? That's amazing. What does it mean to be a co-educator? Right? Or a community partner who says, we need this, I love this one. We need less evidence-based practice, right? Because that's the standard in government funding for science, evidence-based practice. So we need less evidence-based practice and more practice-based evidence. That's brilliant. Talk about an epistemological shift, right? Or recently, a community partner said to me, as the university rises, the community needs to rise as well. Right? And I think really that's sort of what we're talking about here. Right? Community partners are amazing knowledge sources. Right? We just need to get them into the conversation. Right? So yeah, none of this is easy. Nobody ever said it was easy. It's like Ira Harkavy says, you know, this isn't rocket science. It's much harder than that. Yeah.
I wanted to comment on something that you said earlier about linking this kind of work to the work of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. I think there's something else that needs to be part of the discussion too, and this is just my opinion, that inclusion is not the same as assimilation.
Yeah.
And in my mind, but for too long, I think it has been equated with assimilation. We'll let you in, we'll accept you as you are, but you can't stay that way. Now, at the end of this process of engagement, you need to be the mirror image of the others in the academy. So whenever I think we're able to strike a balance between, what we say about diversity and inclusion and then collaborating with those community partners, then I think these things will begin to work in an excellent way.
Yeah.
Right now, it's very stressful for me.
Yeah, and I also think, from my perspective, it comes back to this question of we really need to rethink the institution.